Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. Today I talk with Andy, Dash, and Mike from Tokyo Citadel. The group's goal is to move Bitcoin adoption, use, and knowledge forward in Tokyo. They run a Bitcoin podcast and organise regular meetups and events. In this episode, we discuss Bitcoin in Japan and its perceptions by the public, as well as the Bitcoin development and innovation that is taking place, and what the current economic and political landscape is. We also talk about spending and using Bitcoin in Japan. I previously lived in Tokyo for 5 years, and it was very interesting to learn about where the Bitcoin community is at today. If you want to get in touch with me, please send an email to hello@thetransformationofvalue.com and I will get back to you. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to support the show, please consider streaming some Satoshis via your favorite podcasting 2.0 platform such as Fountain or Breeze. Otherwise, on to the show.
Yeah, actually, the spring just kicked off a couple days ago, so we're slowly warming up here. Cherry blossom season. Today's the big. I think today's the big day, right, Mike?
Yeah, we're actually after this, we're going to be going to do a hanami. Go look at the sakuras, basically.
Yeah. No, that's brings back memories. Well, look, I'm really appreciate you guys making the time to catch up. As you know, I spent 5 years living in Tokyo, and so it's a bit of a trip down memory lane to catch up with you, and I guess find out a little bit about what's happening in Tokyo and Japan, just in regards to Bitcoin, what adoption is like for merchants, and just where the scene is at. Last time I was there, 2019. It wasn't that long ago, but I wasn't really in the space where I was looking that closely at Bitcoin. Compared to now. So, firstly, where did you guys meet? How did the Tokyo Citadel group come together, and kind of what's your origin story?
Well, we all kind of came to things independently. When I was here, I got into Bitcoin. I'm a class of 2019, 2020, around then guy, and I was looking for various things going on in Tokyo, and at the time there wasn't really too much, but there was an Azteco distributor here, and I went and I kind of sought him out. If you know what the Azteco thing does, that non-KYC Bitcoin thing, so I went to go find him to see what that was all about, which was a journey in and of itself, because it was listed, but it was listed in the wrong way, in the wrong place. So there were a couple attempts. I had to get a Sherpa to try and find this thing. Eventually I did, kind of got hooked up with him, and he the guy had a group that was kind of coming together, and a few of us soon thereafter ended up connecting at a Bitcoin meetup that was thrown by some of the local Japanese guys here, and we got to know each other, got to talk, and little by little we started to come to be friends and get together with a little more frequency. Am I leaving anything out?
Yeah, we met up at it's like a native Japanese speaking meetup that they do, a Bitcoin meetup in Tokyo. But we were looking for more of like a expat English speaking oriented group for Bitcoiners here. So we first kicked it off by just starting a group that does regular meetups, and then a little while later, the three of us just decided to to do a podcast and sit down and talk about Bitcoin on a regular basis. So we've been doing that it's been a couple months, 2-3 months now.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm interested in 2 points you said. One was Azteco, which I understand is an ethical sats provider, and that's where you can go and effectively buy a voucher from a shop. Any kind of shop can sell these vouchers, and that you can redeem those for Bitcoin through Lightning, right?
Or on chain. Yep.
On chain, yeah. That's because I am familiar with that system, and it seems like it's quite powerful. So is that quite a common system in Japan? Is that available in the various places?
Well, there's only been a few places that I've been able to find Azteco distributed here in Japan. So no, but I think that it gets a lot of traction with locals. I mean, everyone is people who use the ethical sats provider there is usually pretty secretive, but it seems like there is a fair amount of people using it kind of on the DL, from what I can gather.
Interesting.
A lot of it's word of mouth, I think. Sorry, this is Dash.
Yes.
Are you hearing me loud and clear, guys? I had a
No
bit of Zoom
problem.
trouble. Yeah, coming in.
Yeah, you're good.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's I was I've been in Bitcoin for a while, but I'm sort of a naturally kind of private person, and so I wasn't really involved in the meetup scene and what have you out here. But what I did is because going down the rabbit hole, I realized that one important thing was to acquire sats ethically, to preserve my own privacy and just for the good of the whole sort of ecosystem. I looked into all the options of acquiring sats that way, and one of the things that I'd heard, I think it was on a Marty podcast, was about Azteco. I think he maybe interviewed the founder, and so I got interested in that. I was like, oh, I wonder if you can get them in Japan. And I did a web search, and it was not easy to find. Actually, I ended up finding this blog that was written by a Japanese guy, so it was all in Japanese, and he wasn't explicit with where the shop was, but he sort of gave a hint. And so essentially, anyone who was motivated enough to sort of follow the breadcrumbs could find it, right? But I think that's the sort of the state of it. It's not like it's well advertised, or you could just stumble onto it. It has to be through word of mouth, or you have to sort of make an effort yourself to find it. So that's how I found it in Japan. I've actually, and to contrast that with other markets, because I really like Azteco, but I tried to use it in the UK and I tried to use it in the US when I was there, and I found that every place I went to that was on the map basically just told me, no, we don't do that anymore. Or the guy behind the counter was just like completely nonplussed, didn't know what on earth I was talking about. So, my experience with Azteco has been sort of hit and miss. But I think once you've found a good place to buy, then that's kind of gold, because you can keep going there. But it's kind of hard to find a place that's still doing it. And I think that's the same for Japan and the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, interesting. I do think that's an interesting point to contrast. Here in New Zealand, there is an awareness, I think, of non-KYC ethical sats, and that whole thing. But we are, I feel like it is a little bit more open and a little bit more naive, perhaps is another way of looking at it. And I'm interested in something you said, Andy, just about the difference between sort of the expat foreigner scene and sort of the local Japanese scene, and how you would, or how any of you would sort of characterize the perception and that relationship with the state, with the Bank of Japan, that kind of central banking system. Because I feel in New Zealand, I mean, it's a lot more accessible. I literally walk past the Reserve Bank every day. It's right there. I know these people. I've met them in real life. It's not an insurmountable we're not below these layers of aristocracy effectively to get to that system. Whereas I felt, just from Japan, it's a lot more, the banks are mega banks and they're just impossible to deal with. And perhaps that changes the way people feel about their relationship with an alternative like Bitcoin. I mean, how would you just describe that dynamic in your words?
Yeah, I mean, or at least from what I've seen here, now there's been a few iterations of kind of Bitcoin consciousness in Japan, of which I've missed the other ones, but the ones now, it's coming off kind of a dead time, and people's involvement with Bitcoin is probably at an all-time low, unfortunately speaking. But as it relates to central banking and banks, things like that, yeah, they are. Yeah, your perception is absolutely right. I mean, first of all, your average Japanese person probably doesn't ever consider such things. They're even less attuned to thinking about the matrix than in New Zealand or the UK or the US. So they just take it as a matter of course that this is what it is. The Bank of Japan just is a little demigod that we worship, and he does what he does. He cuts the head off the chicken, and he runs around and does whatever magic he does, and thus we have our money. I don't know that many people question it. I don't think many people care, although they are starting to now. When the price of their food goes up a little bit, we've noticed a little bit more of a consciousness towards who's doing what and why is this more expensive, and why are my eggs more than they were, and how come my snacks are more than what they are now, and as time goes on, things like the social security system here, and they have a new my card system. Some of these things will perhaps start to register in people's minds that they need to be paying attention. Difficulty being that it might be too late at that point. I know Dash has a number of thoughts on that, but yeah, sadly, a lot of people just are not aware of what's going on. They don't much care. Life is pretty good here, especially in Tokyo. If you go out in some of the other parts, it's not as affluent. But here in the downtown mega city of Japan, here people generally have pretty good lives. They're generally making enough money, so they're not worried about it yet. But as said, that seems to be changing little by little.
Yeah, just my two sats. It's exactly as I see it, exactly as Andy describes it there. There isn't there isn't really a sort of pain point for the local population, although there clearly is as a kind of outsider looking in. You can see how people's quality of life has degraded over the last couple of decades, but it's the classic frog slowly boiling in the water, in that people kind of haven't noticed it. And there's this the great lie that there's no inflation in Japan, although there is inflation recently. But I have seen inflation with my own eyes since I've been here. I've seen it and it shows up in shrinkflation a lot. So you'll buy something in the shop and it was 300 grams last month and it's 200 grams this month, right? Or the service just gradually gets worse in the restaurants. Another way you'll see inflation show up is just the erosion in people's work-life balance. So people just work longer and longer hours for less and less bonuses and money, etc., and things like that. And so we're definitely getting to the point where inflation has been hidden for a while via those means, but it's kind of showing up very explicitly now. As Andy was saying, there's very, very, very. I mean, they even have a word for it. It's the price rush is the literal translation. All the brands are sort of in union raising prices by up to 30% on some items, right? So it's definitely something where I think people will start feeling the pain more, and they'll be looking for the solutions. But unfortunately, they're way behind. These sort of information, the resources that we've got now in the West and the English speaking world, I feel are so advanced, so much more than we even had in 2018. Japan doesn't even have the resources that we had in 2018 or 2017. So there's just a lot of work to be done to educate out here.
Yeah, I absolutely, I can appreciate that. And as I said, the last time I was in Japan, 2019, this wasn't something that was really on my radar. And I can attest to this idea of, you have a comfortable life and you can kind of just make ends meet. That's certainly the vibe in Tokyo, where I was. You just go to work, you work hard, and there's something quite rewarding just in that, in itself. And so you're not necessarily looking at what's going on outside, especially in the rest of the world. Certainly from Japan, the rest of the world can seem like it's quite far away. And so currency crises happening in places like Lebanon, different macro events don't really feel like they're relevant when you're in that milieu of Japan. But it's interesting coming back to New Zealand, which is also an island, but I feel very plugged in and kind of aware of the ripples that are coming out, from the United States, from different places. It's just we're sort of more plugged into that that whole thing. So that is interesting in terms of resources, because you saw, I mean, I remember certainly in the broader kind of space, there was a lot of murmurings around ICOs and the whole shitcoin thing in 2017 and 18. And I remember people around me talking about it, but I still feel like the analysis of it, which was quintessentially a shitcoin analysis, was that it's just a thing that you can do. It's not transformative in the deeper way that Bitcoin is. It doesn't represent that challenge to the state and to central banking, which must be, I mean, in Japan, it's been such a long period of this, deflationary kind of grind since 1989, right? Was the stock market crash. So it's just been a slow grind, and I absolutely I know what you mean about the shrinkflation, the chocolate bars and things just slowly getting smaller over time. It's quite curious.
Yeah, and on that note about the shit coins, by the way, that's a great point you raise. The shit coins, I feel, are especially in a top-down manner. So a lot of the government officials are talking about Web 3.0, for example, and the metaverse. A lot of the big corporates as well. I think probably exactly for that reason that you mentioned, that you've sort of got this vague promise of good things in the future and growth and etc., but without the challenge to authority. And the challenge to authority is a big one, big hurdle to get over here. And even amongst like people who are effectively, kind of de facto Bitcoin maxis, Japanese people, they won't say they're Bitcoin maxis, or they won't sort of push that line because it's kind of it's too disagreeable, right? You know, if somebody in the room was an Ethereum owner, you might offend them, kind of thing. And so you definitely get a culture of people being more, you know, or less willing to kind of challenge authority or challenge, you know, bad ideas in an explicit way. So so yeah, that's we see a lot, unfortunately, a lot more shitcoinery out here as a result, I believe.
That's also partially because they're not in it for the revolution, or however you want to put it, or the how the pushback that, or the safety that a Bitcoin stance would take. A lot of them just are online. The locals here, the ones that got into it, are just kind of like online nerdy types. So NFTs, although not my jam, they love these things. Some kind of digital collectible is the panacea of excitement for these guys. So that is a bigger draw than selling somebody a Bored Ape or whatever is a lot easier of a sell than here is this hard money. That concept doesn't even really register for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, though. If you dive into the history of Japan and you look at the history of revolution, it's something that can be. It seems as if it's never going to come back, and you'll never have revolution again. But you only have to look at the student rights of the 1960s, or the tumultuous 1930s for these eras of massive change in a very quick period of time. And I think certainly we can learn from that, and we can look at how those periods were managed by big government and just sort of the structures and the apparatus of the government. I certainly feel, I mean, with New Zealand, historically, my image when I was living in Japan, thinking back to New Zealand, I was like, man, I just love how the government never had anything to do with my life. Because I remember in Japan, you're going to your ward office and your city office. It seems like every month you've got to go to fill out some paperwork or do something, and it's like I just felt this constant surveillance by the government, even though it is actually quite a cash heavy society. It's like there was this kind of thing where I always felt quite invaded, whereas in New Zealand, I was like, man, I don't have to do any of that. But it's actually, in a way, the opposite, because New Zealand's a digital society. We've got, EFTPOS cards and credit cards for everything. All your data is quite centralized. And I actually feel, in a roundabout way, Japan's actually a lot more ready and able to sort of have people, opt out. A lot of cash-based stuff already, a lot of things that can kind of, there's a lot of leaks on that boat of the Japanese state, as opposed to a place like New Zealand. So, I mean, there is some interesting contrast there.
They're aware of that, and they're closing the net, though, I believe. I mean, this is maybe just doom and dash, being too negative about the developments in the news, but I'm seeing a lot of talk about CBDCs. So there's a company out here called JCB, which is the largest credit card company, and they have with the permission of the government, the explicit permission of the government, they're running these trials for CBDCs. They're linking them to Andy mentioned this My Number card, which is like a social security system that was introduced in 2015. So that the goal for the government is that I think it was something like 90% of the population by the end of this year will have one of these cards. It includes your face, an image, a picture of your face. It's got a chip in it, and the goal would be to then link that to the CBDCs, right? In terms of pushing the CBDCs onto a reluctant population, they have a few levers there. So one is that they're talking about the survivability in the case of an earthquake or something, for example, where the infrastructure was impacted. A key component of these trials is that they have some sort of local survivability. So you're still able to use them even if there was no power, for example. And the second part of the trials is the ease of use, and so as it's an elderly population here in Japan, and so they have to demonstrate that this is just a single plastic card, so it's easy for older people to use. And I think with those, if they can nail those in the trial, plus they've got this whole narrative around how cash is dirty, and I've also seen a narrative about how cash is expensive. Can you believe it? These people, as if the seniorage they enjoy isn't enough already, they're talking about how much it costs them to have to produce cash every year. So I think they'll be able to push the CBDCs very soon as a result. I would even expect them within the next 5 years.
Interesting. I just wanted to drill into that a little bit. So regarding the cash is dirty thing, I would like to just find out a little bit from your guys' perspective around the whole COVID thing, because certainly in New Zealand, as I was saying to Andy just before we started recording, we went through a mini dictatorship here. The New Zealand population is naive to totalitarianism. It seems like China and North Korea are very far away, and that would never happen here. And though in a period of about 6 months, we went from a relatively free democratic country to basically locked down and told what to do. And that was quite shocking for me personally, but people kind of went along with it. But as time has gone on, I feel like there's been, in a way, the actual inoculation has been against that, and a lot of people said, "Oh, we can't let this happen again." But in Japan, I still see everyone's masking up. There's still a lot, you've got to test negative to come into the country. I mean, what's the situation on the ground at the moment? Are they still susceptible to that narrative?
Yeah, the mask thing is hard. I mean, the mask thing, yeah, I think is a little bit more to do with a cultural shame hiding kind of thing. They like being able, like, you were here, you saw them. Even the masks were always a thing, and then now it's just like, good, now I can wear this thing all the time and I don't look weird and I don't have to worry about it because now I get to cover my face. So it's more of a fashion statement at this point. They're slowly coming out of it. Like, I'll see probably one in not high numbers. I wouldn't go so far as to say 10%, but maybe 4 or 5% of the people now are not wearing them. I'm not the only one who isn't. The good thing about being a foreigner here in Japan is, like, during the whole lockdown, like, there were social rules that were not enforced, of which I had to follow none. So it was great. It was like living in a free country for me. Everybody else had constraints on them, but I did not. The nature of masking and the rules to get in, they're kind of not even kind of, they're very explicitly a vassal state of the US. So when the US decides that they don't want to have the stupid COVID rule anymore, Japan will not. I mean, they've basically given their military over recently to the US. They're being used as a base of operations for some kind of warfare thing with China, potentially with China in the coming days. They've bought a bunch of U.S. hardware. They're stocking up over there. So what the U.S. says, Japan does, and it is not. When COVID is not an issue for whatever regime runs the U.S. anymore, then it won't be an issue here anymore. Sadly, I wouldn't expect things to change until they're told they're allowed to change.
Interesting point on that. I mean, that's essentially correct, but I think what we've seen, and to Andy's point, yeah, the Japanese administration is 100% just taking orders from the US. I mean, I was looking at the news today. I think Kishida visited Ukraine. I think I saw the news that said that came up today, and I was like, all the problems we have domestically, and he's what is he doing over in Ukraine? But he's just following the party line. And on the COVID thing, yeah, exactly. So Japan sort of restricted, how do you say, like loosened up the kind of guidelines along with the US. But one interesting thing to note is that even though we had there was a big deal made about the 13th of March, where apparently everybody was going to be able to sort of not wear masks if they didn't want to anymore. Although that was never legislated, it was always just strongly encouraged. But from the 13th of March, it was like, look, we'll sort of leave it up to you whether you want to do it or not. But we were joking about it on one of our podcasts earlier a couple of weeks ago. So we were thinking of doing a bet as to whether people would actually take off the masks or not. But I'm seeing around me, it's like 90% plus people still wearing the masks, and I actually think this is probably a point of embarrassment for the Japanese, the kind of the authorities. You'll contrast things like, I don't know if you follow baseball, but there's the World Baseball Classic being played right now, and so there's some games that are played in Japan and there's some games that are played over in the US. But I mean, the contrast between the two, in that the US, everyone's just there's no mass, everyone's happy, it's like life as usual, everyone's going back to business, compared to Japan, where it's like 90% plus mask, and it's muted, and it doesn't feel right. So I think it's an interesting thing that the Japanese people will follow orders in some cases, but there's also a kind of quiet resistance as well. And I think the masks are possibly a sign, ironically, of quiet resistance in Japan right now, as they're refusing to take them off, which is, I think, a bottom up thing rather than a top down thing.
Interesting. It's almost like they're being stubborn about it. You made us wear these things, and now we're just going to keep doing it. Which is, I mean, it's powerful. But I must admit, for myself, New Zealand was like that a year ago, and within a week of the mask mandate being lifted, just the palpable difference. Being on a bus, walking down the street, and not having to just see these things over people's faces, because there's a certain amount of body language and stuff, which even for Japan, I mean, it's 90% of human communication, and so being cut off from that, it's quite depressing, I think. And I feel that I'm going back in May to Tokyo, and I'm just a bit on the fence about how it's going to be. I'm just sort of willing to accept whatever happens, but am I going to be thrown back into what it was like in 2020, 2021, when everyone was freaking out? I mean, how would you describe just the attitude, though, like the feeling? I mean, is there this sort of sense of heaviness still in the air, or is it really just the superficialness of the masks? Like, what is it like? So business, social life, I mean, is that still impacted?
I'm actually curious what Mike has to say on this one, because Dash and I have been here for a long time, so we're jaded and miserable people. Mike has not become miserable yet.
Yeah, well, I think what Cody said there about how it's kind of just this like heavy blanket, it's like a depressive thing where everyone's wearing the mask. I think that more accurately describes the feeling. Like it's true that everyone is just wearing the mask. You go on the train, it's probably 95% of people, actually more like 99 even, are wearing the mask, but you don't have what I've been here for a year now. And even last year when COVID was much bigger around the world, like the hysteria, you never had here any kind of like government mandate for masks or lockdowns or vaccines the way you did in other countries. And you never really had, at least in my experience and from what I hear, there was never any kind of like unhinged, like insane hysteria where people are freaking out. Like I'm sure you've seen in New Zealand and Australia and America and European countries where like they'll scream at you and tell you you're killing grandma or something. Like uh, even just being on the train with everybody wearing a mask here, I've maybe gotten one dirty look when I'm not wearing mine in the past year. And maybe like there have been a couple buildings I've walked into where they have told me to put on a mask, but almost everywhere else, people just mind their own business and they'll be wearing their mask, but they won't really care if you're following the same rule.
Oh, that is interesting. Maybe that's a bit of a glimmer of hope, because I mean, New Zealand certainly. I mean, I got abused myself, and it was insane. And we had illegal mandates in place. People were getting injected because they had to, or they were going to lose their jobs. And so it was really insane. And to see, I mean, I know Japan was actually quite conservative in that piece, in terms of forcing people to do things. So, I mean, maybe this gives a bit of a glimmer of hope that there is actually beneath the veneer of the mask, that sort of masks, that there's actually not as much deep. Or maybe it's apathy, I don't know. But I would like to segue a little bit into just a discussion around sort of on-ramps and off-ramps, and understanding a little bit, I know Japanese banks are these behemoths. In terms of actually buying just over the, through your, standard online exchanges, KYC exchanges. I mean, what is that like in Japan? What are the ramps like? Are they easy to get to? Is there paperwork involved? How does that all work?
Well, Dash has a number of thoughts on this, I'm sure. But the best of the exchanges was Kraken. Kraken actually was over here, and they were here before, and they closed down. They came back, and they closed down again. So now we are left with local Japanese exchanges, which are most of them are off limits to foreign-born folks. So unless you're Japanese, you can't use them, and the ones that you can use are spectacularly bad. It's like the level of it's like 2007, Internet Explorer level terrible user interface and whatnot. Not only are you prompted to buy such glorious coins as Lisk and whatever came out of the depths of 2014 or something, trying to get the things off of the exchange into your own private wallet is a challenge. Actually getting the bank transfer over there is usually not too much of a challenge. The banks themselves will send the money where you want, so that hasn't become an issue, at least in my experience. But the companies themselves are, I can't definitively tell you they're less than reputable, but they sure as hell feel less than reputable. And I was saddened when Kraken left, just because if I was going to send somebody to get Bitcoin for the first time, I could send them there and it would be a relatively normal experience. But now it's like, okay, go to one of these other things and maybe you'll get signed up in 7 weeks and maybe you'll get your Bitcoin. I hope you do. Good luck.
Yeah, just a couple of observations from me. One, to Andy's point, I think Kraken was probably the best here, but they left Japan recently. It's the second time they've left Japan. And an interesting thing when they did leave Japan is that the people who'd bought Ethereum and staked it there, it wasn't quite clear how they were, or if they were going to get their their money back, right? Because I don't know how much you know about Ethereum, but it can't be unstaked, right? It's just sort of a one-way thing, and I don't think they'd written the code. I don't think they've written the code yet for unstaking. And so there was some talk about, well, there'll be a window of time in the future when they've finally written this code where you might be able to reclaim your tokens, and if you don't, they're going to be sent to the regulator. So I thought that was quite interesting and quite instructive on why Bitcoin only. But on the Bitcoin only point as well, another thing I think is instructive is by its absence is there's no, to my knowledge, Bitcoin only exchange in Japan, so they all tend to be very shitcoinery, and I think that just maybe talks to what we were discussing earlier, which is the Japanese kind of don't get this as a revolution. There isn't really Bitcoin maximalism out here. The final thing though is maybe an optimistic note. So when FTX collapsed, my understanding is, based on latest information I saw, the FTX Japan, the people using that exchange were actually made whole. So whatever the regulators are doing, and I disagree with a lot of it, but it seems, maybe it was accidental, maybe it was by design, I'm not sure, but it seems like they did have sort of decent legal framework in place to actually protect people who had, who could have potentially lost their money in that collapse. So that was one sort of bright thing I thought from the regulator.
That's interesting. I'm curious. Obviously, there's layers and layers of bureaucracy in Japan, but in terms of whether foreign or Japanese, is there any people or companies or initiatives, startups that have really emerged in the Bitcoin space? Key individuals or people who have sort of got a voice that you feel is present in Bitcoin in Japan?
The group Diamond Hands, which is a big Asian, big Japanese. Are they a Lightning service provider? Dash, do you know? But they're big. They're growing in their Lightning presence, and it's run by a guy named Koji Higashi, who's an OG Bitcoin guy. He has good access to kind of the global Bitcoin scene because he's educated in Chicago and is able to kind of interface between Japan and the rest of the world. So that's helpful. But sadly, there isn't a ton of stuff going on. I know the RGB, and this will be outside of my explanation ability, but the RGB guys are over here. I think that's it's either started in Japan or heavily worked on here in Japan. So they have that going on in the background for development, but major companies, not as far as I know, outside of what Koji does with his Diamond Hands group.
Yeah, I mean, no real major companies that I know of. I do want to mention Tedeko Neriki, if you're familiar with her. She translated Safe's book, The Bitcoin Standard, into Japanese, and I think she also did The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. She's fantastic. She really gets it. She also has a website called Lost in Bitcoin. I think it's .jp, and that's a great collection of resources. She's involved with the Diamond Hands team as well. So she would be someone who, and again, I mean, it's similar with Koji. She speaks excellent English, right? So she's able to get she's able to get access to, what's going on in the States and the West, and then just kind of translate that for a Japanese audience. So she's very, important Bitcoin, I would say, out here. But also, interestingly enough, there's a couple of projects like, for example, mempool.space with Wiz, who's they're based. I mean, I don't think they're based formally anywhere, but there's a number of devs and Wiz himself who live in Japan. And also I think one of the devs on BTC Pay server also is living here. So there's a number of like pretty prominent Bitcoiners who kind of are living in Japan. I think from before Bitcoin, and so whether that's just there's something about, I don't know, the sort of people that could be attracted to Bitcoin, and the Venn diagram crossover between Bitcoin and Japan. I don't know, or if it's just some sort of coincidence, but it does seem that Japan has a lot. Despite the fact that the majority of the population, certainly the authorities, don't understand it at all. There's this strange kind of connection you've got, going right back to the name that Satoshi Nakamoto chose, right, to Japan, which I find kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think with the population, especially in a place like Tokyo, it can seem that no one gets it. However, I was working in tech when I was over there, and I know certainly there were people who were on board and with the program, but it's just, amongst the millions of people that you pass by every day, it can seem like it's a small number. But comparatively, I mean, even in New Zealand, I mean, no one gets it. But because it's a smaller population, and I know a few Bitcoiners in real life, it seems like there's more of them, more people who actually get it. So I would argue there's probably a bit of optimism there, because I have met some extremely talented developers, and I feel that the Lightning kind of layer 2 side could perhaps offer some real opportunity, as you said, RGB and Diamond Hands, these groups, because there's certainly a lot of really highly skilled front-end developers, and kind of more the web stack types as opposed to Bitcoin core type developers. And given the population density as well, something like Lightning, I mean, you've already got Pay, was it Suica and Paymo, and these kind of like card systems for paying in shops. Line, WeChat, all these different kinds of like services, which there's no way anyone would use that in New Zealand, but because of the density, you could arguably have, you could offer these in shops, and there would actually be a huge market, even if it's super niche. So, I mean, that could perhaps be a point of optimism.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges here, it's the chicken and the egg problem, right? Like, you got to get the Bitcoin into the people's hands so that they can potentially use it via something like Lightning, and with adoption being what it is, like I said, there's been a couple of phases of Bitcoin in Japan. Do you know btcmap.org? It goes around and plots all the different things. So I went through that a couple of months ago, and I had seen that there was 50 or 100 shops in Tokyo that would take Bitcoin, and I went through one by one, and it wasn't anything but a kind of a delete. It was just kind of a demolition. It was just like clipping them off one by one. So it seems like during the Roger Ver era, there was a lot of adoption, or he got a number of people to start accepting these things, and sadly that has fallen off. But there are things here which still remain. Like, when you're over here, I'm sure you saw Bic Camera, that big department store that takes Bitcoin, for example.
No way.
It's one of the odd kind of large scale stores over here that will actually take it.
That's insane. Yeah, because I mean, that's like a huge, it's like where you'd go and buy a camera or
it's a mega store,
tripod.
Right? Yeah, they're all over the place. So they do take it. It's a bit clunky. They run, the way they run it is it's on chain, and it runs this kind of goofy system. But you can do it. I have seen it done successfully. I myself have tried it a couple of times and have failed in my attempt, but I have seen others do it. So may they continue. I want to actually get a bunch of people together to go, like, DDoS attack the various big camera stores. Like, everybody on one day just go to these, get 50 people out to start using Bitcoin at the store, so that just to force them to update their system so we can use it like regular human beings over here.
I'm curious.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'm just curious. You mentioned Roger Ver. Is he not? He has a connection to Japan, right? Does he live there or something? Or,
as far as I know, he lives there.
Yeah. Because I know that in the early days as well, Mount Gox was like literally in Shibuya there. There was this kind of like energy, which certainly I was only tangentially aware of, but at that time, but it felt like it kind of bloomed, and there was a thing happening, and then it all just sort of went away, and now we're just it's just an echo of its former self.
The Japanese do not like when things blow up. Like, stability is a major cultural value here, right? So something like
Yes.
the Mount Gox really set everything back. I actually don't know what it looked like before, because I was unaware. I had no idea really what was going on. I'd be curious to know the history from some of the folks, what was going on, because there was actually legislation put forward. Like, the government was paying attention to it, and they were, I don't know if supportive was the right word, but they were certainly not anti-Bitcoin for a long time. And then that popped off, and that kind of changed the stance to everything, as far as I'm aware.
Certainly. That's interesting. So I think taking that a bit further, I mean, ultimately Bitcoin is a grassroots thing, and I think my own observations have been that it's quite hard to develop advocacy and companies come and go, people come and go, but it is that grassroots connection and people's discussion and interpersonal relationships that really help build that. In terms of the meetup scene, both foreign and Japanese and the combination of both, I mean, how does that look like at the moment? I mean, you said there's still a lot of that kind of shitcoinery going on, but you've got obviously the Tokyo group. I mean, is this something that has cultural awareness? Are there hundreds of people going to these kinds of meetups? Like, what's the vibe on the ground?
Actually, I think Mike could give. Yeah, go ahead. Mike probably has better perspective because he's been around longer.
Yeah, the meetups, I mean, because I only got here like a year ago, so I showed up and like I can't really speak Japanese, but it was one of those Diamond Hand meetups was the first one I went to, and it's where I met these guys. And I think there are some local Japanese Bitcoiners, although I don't know, like, when you compare them to the expat Bitcoiners, I don't know how hardcore they are. I think out of the people we know, the most hardcore Bitcoiners they're all foreigners, right? And I know Teru Go is like a pretty hardcore Bitcoiner, and maybe I just don't know because when I meet them, I can't really speak. Some of them only speak Japanese, so I can't really communicate with all of them. But yeah, I mean, from what I can see, I think it's probably, when you go to a Bitcoin meetup here in Tokyo, it's probably more than 50% non-Jap, or maybe it's like 50-50 Japanese and foreigners.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I would certainly be curious as to what the discourse is like. I mean, Japan does have a history of the gold standard. And as I said, I mean, it seems like since the stock market crash, it's been this sort of melee, but going back historically, there are precedents for sound money and different ways of doing things in very short periods of time. So it'd be interesting to know if there is actually new writing out there or kind of discourse in this space, or even like podcasts or things. I mean, I might do a bit of research myself, but just seeing kind of where the conversation's at, because it's really, that political relationship with the state and the money printer and all of that. And I mean, you've got the history of, the big banks, the Zaibatsu, all of that, which kind of feeds a very different narrative to what we have in New Zealand, and as I said, I can walk into the Reserve Bank and go and just like talk to literally the senior policy advisors, they're right there, and I've been making submissions and kind of being involved in that space. Not to say that it's going to have any effect on what they choose to do, but just the layers and that, again, the aristocracy, I think of the Japanese system feels like it's bigger, but it's also perhaps more vulnerable to change. It's kind of ossified into this thing and this institution which no one's really happy with, but it's just been around so long that they've accepted it.
Yeah, one of the things that we try to speculate on our show is like, what would it take for Japan to get onto a Bitcoin standard? I think Dash is the most, he has the most doomer of an outlook, and he doesn't think it'll happen. I mean, I think you mentioned earlier on the pod that like change can happen really quickly and efficiently in Japan, like uniformly across the whole country in a very short period of time, and including on like technological changes. So I could see something like Bitcoin becoming embraced nationally or at a nationwide level in Japan. But I think Japan's geopolitical status, its current one, is not going to permit that, and it would need to basically break free of this like occupation that it's under by the globalist American empire. And like, as far as that's still there, as far as it, like the country of Japan wants to submit to America, it's going to be submitting economically as well. And there don't really seem to be signs of that happening at the moment, but you never know. Things like that can change very quickly, and it's a very volatile time geopolitically right now across the whole world, and it looks like a lot of changes are taking place. So You never know. That's my perspective, I guess.
I'd be curious to dive into it a little bit as well in terms of the media perspective. I'm not sure if you guys follow Japanese media. I mean, I certainly don't follow mainstream media myself anymore, but my take, just coming into this from the outside, but like I do feel like maybe it's a little bit more of a fair treatment of Bitcoin compared to what we see in New Zealand and maybe the US and other places. I mean, but what would your perspective be in terms of the FUD, the energy use arguments, that sort of stuff? I mean, how are the Japanese media talking about it?
I don't know if it's just the media. I tend to look at the business news mainly, and it's more that Bitcoin is ignored than anything, right? Even if there's a rally in the price, it doesn't. I mean, back in 2017, that would be on the TV or that would be in the news, even price movements, things like that. But now, even that doesn't show up in the media, and there isn't really even that much FUD. It's almost as if they feel like Bitcoin's something that happened in 2017 and the world kind of moved on. And so you'll read a lot about Web 3.0 and the metaverse. They're obsessed with the metaverse. I don't know what it is about these like 50, 60, 70-year-olds running these old corporations and politicians, but they are convinced we're all going to be living, with one of these Facebook VR things on our heads and living in some sort of virtual world and buying Asahi drinks virtually, for virtual money. And that's to me, that's all I see in the media when it comes to quote unquote crypto, in the business news. And you just don't really see Bitcoin anymore. But I don't know. And Andy, is there anything you've seen?
No, I think that's right. Although I did see some back actually 21, the first run up to 60 grand. It caught a bit of a buzz there. My father-in-law was talking about it. My brother-in-law was talking about it. These kind of people were curious as to what it was, but it was more just kind of a speculative gamble. Like there was nothing behind it more than say, how can I get this quickly and then sell it quickly so that I can get some more yen? Like there was no perception that this was some kind of an alternative system or that this was something to be paid attention to. It's just kind of like a fun gambling opportunity. But yeah, that is right on the metaverse thing. Like, despite its failure and despite its ongoing humiliation publicly through Meta and whatnot, people here still have a fascination with this thing. I think the video game culture of Japan remained such that, the idea of a metaverse, it's just very appealing to the online gaming culture of a number of Japanese folk that grew up in from the 80s, from the 80s onward, especially the 90s, as that became more and more part of a number of young men's lives, and even actually over here a good number of females. The online video game experience, that online video game world that you can immerse yourself in, is just extremely appealing, such that if they could turn Ready Player One into reality, they would choose that in a minute, I think. So anything that offers that, they could care less about the money, the soundness of this, or what none of that makes a difference. They like the idea of Ready Player One, full body suit, immersive virtual reality world, and anything that promises to do that, they'll jump on almost immediately.
I'm going to push back a little on that, Andy, because I don't think it's the people that want that, the Japanese people. I think it's the authorities, and this is my maybe cynical take, and maybe this is going too far, but I feel like they're seeing this as like whether they know it, whether it's intuition or whether they know it, explicitly, I don't know. But it's like this is the opportunity to further kick the can down the road when it comes to the Cantillionaire game, because it's like, look, people have eroded their lives more and more, and we've been able to print money and get away with it because of this deflationary effect of people essentially, getting by with less. And it's the virtualization of the live in the pods kind of idea. So it's like if we can get everyone connected to one of these damn headsets and all of the things that they buy are virtual now, then the cost base is zero. Then we can keep that provides the deflationary kind of tailwind we need to go on to keep printing money, so that we can keep buying up things in the real world and enjoying our lives in the real world, while all the plebs live in virtual sort of serfdom. I believe that's, and so I think it's this top down thing where the kind of business leaders and the politicians are just salivating at the idea of us all connected to these damn headsets, so they can keep the game going for a little longer. That's what I feel it is. But I don't think that people are buying it.
The nice thing about having three hosts is that when Dash and I disagree, which is all the time, Mike can come in and explain why Dash is wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the whole FUD front, I guess when it comes to like mining and energy FUD, maybe that's just not relevant here because I don't think anyone really mines here. Or maybe there's some people who do local small home mining, but like electricity is really expensive in Japan, and I think it usually just won't make sense to mine. But yeah, I think generally, like maybe you guys know more about how the Japanese media works, but my impression from Japanese society is like FUD and hysterical media brainwashing doesn't work the same way here that it does in the West. Like where they'll be like, oh, like the oceans are boiling and Greta Thunberg is the hero that will save us. Like that, I think that kind of thing doesn't exist here. Like, or like the Trump is the new Hitler. I feel like people don't have that mentality where they need to get all riled up and like unhinged about things. Is that?
Well, it's a lot further away, I certainly remember but feeling like, the world is over there across an ocean and it didn't matter in Japan. The closest we got was maybe a North Korean missile would be something that we poke our heads out the window and have a look at the sky. But, the elections, the US Trump, all of that stuff was over there and it didn't matter here. That was kind of my feeling at the time.
Yeah. Does that sound right to you guys, Dash and Andy? Because you guys consume the real Japanese media. I can't read it.
Well, the newspapers certainly do cover international events, but they're in a very objective way, right? Like it's just facts. There isn't that sensationalism that you mentioned, Mike.
Well, and that's a good thing about the Japanese news. I mean, one of the reasons I read the business paper out here is because just to stay informed. But I could read an English language thing to stay informed as well, but it's just most of the English language newspapers now are all opinion, right? And there's a big photograph of the journalist at the top and then some opinion that they have, and they pass that off as news, and they don't bother to research or do fact checking or anything like that anymore. But in Japan we still have that culture of the why, when, where, whatever the 5 W's were, right, that they taught us at school. So they'll give you all the facts and they don't tend to give you opinions. You won't even have the photograph of the journalist, and even the name of the journalist is often right at the end of the article. So they put the news front and center, which I think is one positive thing we still have in Japan. It's one of the ways that Japan is behind the rest of the world, or behind the West, in a good way, right? There are several ways that Japan is sort of behind in a good way, and that's one of them.
Yeah, and I can attest to that. I know a journalist in Japan, and just as with all things, they follow a very masterful approach, and they wouldn't compromise on their value system. They're in it for life effectively, and so there isn't that kind of cheap clickbaity type. I mean, there is in other areas, but in terms of mainstream news, it's very prestigious to have a job at Mainichi Shimbun or Kyodo or one of these news outlets. And they take it very seriously. And so, I mean, that's where you also get a history of whistleblowers and kind of scandals being uncovered through, really deep detective work from journalists, especially corporate scandals and things like that. So, I mean, there are people who take this very seriously. And I agree. I think it is a positive thing that Japan still has is, a solid journalist base. So I mean, that's really interesting. The other thing I'd just be curious maybe on your guys' perspective is there was a lot of news, just a lot of chattering around the bonds and Japanese bonds and just sort of what's going on there, especially given the last couple of weeks, but also earlier this year and late last year. I mean, do you have any sort of an insight on what that looks like from your side, what's happening with, these bond instruments? What does it mean?
My 2 cents there is who knows? Seriously, I keep trying to understand what's going on. It keeps looking like the Widowmaker trade is finally going to happen, and there's going to be this speculation mounting on bonds. It's going to break the yield curve control. They're going to have to give that up. Rates are going to have to normalize. We're going to have to be something like at least. I mean, I was expecting at least something like close to Germany's rates, right? I think what is Germany up now? It's like 2.5% or something like that. Like we've got to be going there, right? I mean, it's almost like Japan can't be operating under completely different financial laws of gravity, right? I mean, how long can Japan keep bucking the trend of with the other central banks? But and yet we had these banking issues last week, and what did people do? Apparently, there was a rush to the so-called safe haven of Japanese bonds, and so we actually saw the market, the yields go down, the rates go down, which just I just don't understand. I just do not understand who's buying Japanese bonds and why. And I just who can make sense of it I'm almost at my wit's end now trying to understand this at this point. I don't know if Andy, you've got anything better than that, but for me it's just hands in the air time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, if I knew about the bond structure in such a way that I had anything profound to say, I would not be on this podcast with you all. You would be on I would be discussing something from a much more glorious location than where I'm currently sitting. I think the one thing that they do have going for them is that they're because of the low rates, they're able to borrow at a lower rate. They don't have quite the steam engine behind, rising rates and things like that. So although they own, over 50% of their own bonds, and they have a 260% debt to GDP ratio, or whatever the number is now, they've borrowed at a lower number. So they're borrowing it, under 1% or at 1%, something like that, such that they don't have the rollover coming that something like the U.S. does, where they're at 2% and it's going to roll over to 5 or something like that. So they have a deflationary problem because they have a shrinking population and whatnot. So they've been consistently fighting the other battle. So to put it in the context of what's happening in Europe or the U.S., they're fighting a different game, at least at the moment. And to try and see, it'd be the height of nonsense to listen to me expound on what those two opposing forces are going to mean for the long term of Japan. Although you can, as we talked a little bit earlier, you can see slight shifts happening in terms of size of foodstuffs, slight variations in the housing market, little movements in inflationary prices on certain things. So yeah, Mike, lead us home. What's going on in Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm with Dash, where like you see all the commentators, including a lot of English speaking, like Bitcoin financial analysis type people. They talk a lot about Japan and the bonds, and like you see all the buzzwords like Bank of Japan, European Central Bank, the Fed, JPY, USD. Like they bring out all the buzzwords, and then like I'll read the thread and I'll just have no clue. Maybe I'm too dumb to interpret it, but like I have no clue what they're saying. All I care about at the end of the day is like is yen going up or down, dollar going up or down, Bitcoin going up or down. And I don't know. I can't make those kinds of predictions, but just talking about the yen I've been here for a year now, and I think I have seen a big change like in prices. And I think Dash talked about shrinkflation. I guess there's shrinkflation and shitflation, right? Like you pay the same price for the same size or same quantity or size of the item, and then you also pay the same price for lower quality. I think generally speaking, the prices here, like what you can buy for the price, it's still pretty high quality for cheap when you compare like Japanese products, Japanese food to American food, for example. But I think the prices have gone up pretty significantly since I got here. Like you walk into the konbini and you get an iced coffee or something, or you get some food. It's still cheap, but it's more expensive than it used to be. And I mean, when
I'm curious, oh, sorry, I was going to say, has the tax gone up on consumption tax on things? Is it 8%?
I don't know about the
or?
tax. I don't track the tax. Do you guys?
It's complicated out here now. So it's 10%, but there's certain items you get 8%. And don't ask me to explain what it is. But on the receipt, they'll have two different line items for the tax, 8 and 10%.
Yeah. Sorry, Mike.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I know that there was like a big announcement. I think it was a nationwide announcement, or maybe just Tokyo thing, where they were like, okay, on this date, the prices across all these industries are going up. And it was like an announcement in advance that they made. And I don't know exactly how that works. Did you guys follow that?
Yeah. Well, this is the Neagi Rush, right? So the thing is, a couple of companies had tried to raise prices in the last few years, and they'd always got punished for it, right? In that they'd raise the price and then their sales would drop because everyone's like, well, I'm not going there. And so what I think is this is sort of a perfect storm for a lot of these corporations to essentially coordinate the messaging all at the same time. So we got this Neagi rush, it's like this price rush where, I mean, I have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds since the start of the year. So is that the time frame you're talking, Mike? So like from like January, February, March, this month, you've seen all of these,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, exactly. So that's and I think that's why I think if you get lost in that noise, then you can hopefully raise your prices without the sort of pushback, if you like, or the of people deciding not to use your product or service. So I think that's why they've taken this opportunity.
I can appreciate that. I can just imagine, kind of a grandma sort of, always used to getting the 100 yen thing, and when it goes up to 150, just refusing to pay that. And I can see, the collective sort of bargaining and agreement to actually bring up prices across the line so that everyone, simultaneously does it. Otherwise, it kind of can gut the industry and you start getting shrinkflation. So I can kind of appreciate the cultural aspect of that. And then, the idea of Neagi rush, a price rush, it sort of almost increases inflation because everyone's going out and buying now. So it's interesting.
I don't want to. Sorry, I just one little comment. I don't want to dox myself or anything, but I mean, I work with a large Japanese corporation in my job, and they were even talking about, this was last year, like I can't remember the exact month, but I think it was around September-ish, and they were saying, look, if you guys are going to raise prices on us, like now's the time, kind of thing. And I think back to that conversation now, and I think, God, has it all been decided in a smoky back room, and they knew that this was coming, or maybe they were just smart enough to read the direction of the way things are going. But yeah, that was an interesting sort of thing for me to see.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, one thing that I noticed, and certainly what informed my decision to leave Japan as well, was I definitely felt, 2018, 19 at that time. Well, actually, I really left properly 2018. I was looking at just the future of the country, and I was thinking, man, I was sort of making predictions. It really felt like, we were moving towards working poor, and you got a very hardworking society and culture, but it was just, what you got out the other end was just increasingly less and less. And, New Zealand's no paradise, but certainly I felt like there was at least a little bit more room here for me to do what I needed to do. And so it's interesting now because I'll be going back in May and sort of seeing what the comparison's like. But the kind of what feeds into that now, and this is the perspective I didn't have back then, was that ultimately the modern country of Japan is built upon fiat. I mean, it was all burnt away in the war, and it was through this kind of Bretton Woods money printer kind of thing. At that time, backed by the US dollar, but all of the danchy buildings, all of the apartments, all of the cities were rebuilt in this image of fiat, and you're seeing that start manifesting itself now. And you've got these sort of crumbling old buildings, and everything looks like it's from the 70s. And you think Japan's kind of high tech if you've never been there, but often there's these just industrial areas that are just like out of the 60s and 70s. And that kind of aesthetic of it is very interesting. And that said, though, I mean, it does also have a still very strong industrial base. So there's always these nuances to it. But certainly it's an interesting case study, which is a lot different to many other places in the world.
Yeah, the brutalist architecture of the 70s dominates, large swaths of the city, these big ugly square buildings, very fiat, very unfortunate. And the comment you made on the perception of Japan is very highly technological. I actually tracked that down because I had that as well before I came here, and I was like, all right, I'm moving into the country of the future. This is the land of what's coming next. And I got here and they were using fax machines and whatnot, and I was like, what the hell is this? This is nonsense. Trying to give people an email address, and they have no idea how to use it. But actually, that goes back to an ad campaign from the late '80s from Japan about cool Japan and how they convinced the world that they were a technological and efficient society, which is great until you get here and you find out they're not. particularly technological, and they're not very efficient. God bless them for all that they do well, but those two things are not usually at the top of the list. So despite the image, as you know from living here, they often do not quite hit the mark.
There are glimpses of hope every now and then, but I certainly think that, I mean, looking at through the political lens and the economic lens that I now have of Bitcoin thinking, I can certainly see that, man, I was never thinking about money. I was a consumer. I was an absolute consumer in Japan of, there's not even interest on bank accounts. It's not even a thing, right? It's, at least in New Zealand, there's a pittance of an interest that you get in a savings account, but you don't even get that with your bank books in Japan. So it's certainly an interesting perspective. And what I'd be very interested in is coming back in May and sort of seeing again what it's like.
I just on that point, sorry. To be fair, when I came to Japan, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but it was before the iPhone, and I have to say they were ahead of the rest of the world when it came to mobile phones back then. You had email on the phones, for example, and I think they were one of the first also to have things like payments, digital payments on the phones, and so I think it all went a little bit wrong with Japan when it came to when software became the primary I guess driver of user experience. I don't think Japanese are very good with software, and they're not good with the internet. And when you think about the economic growth that has been driven by software and internet over the last 20, 30 years, that kind of also explains Japan falling behind a bit since they lack skills in those areas. So it's not a complete backwaters, I guess what I'm trying to say, but yeah. But also I'd be interested to hear maybe Mike's take on it, since I wonder, Mike, were you also under that kind of impression that Japan was high tech when you came, and what's the first 12 months been like in terms of whether that was the case or not?
Yeah, I mean, I was under the impression that Japan was like this cyber, or Tokyo at least was this like cyberpunk, like underground tech scene. Like in the middle of the night, you can be walking around the streets underground, like with the neon lights and everything. I was under that impression, but it's really not like that at all. And in fact, everything closes down really early. Like if you're in the city past midnight, you can't even catch a train home, and you'll end up having to take a taxi or something. But I think when it comes to the websites, I don't even know if it's the right way to put it, is that it's like lagging behind, like it's stuck in 2007. I know you were talking about the exchange website before, but I think they intentionally choose these web designs and these UIs that are very foreign to the modern tech scene that you would see from like American sites, for example, where everything's very sleek and minimalist and simple. And I get the impression that these Japanese sites, and it's all about like big blocks of text all over the place, and it's like the opposite design style that you would see in an American website. And I wonder if that comes from like a culture of reading too much manga or something like that. Like, do you guys get that impression too?
I've got a little thought on that. And again, in defense, I mean, Japan holds a very special place in my heart, but I would say, I mean, we could look at this and say, well, maybe the fiat fueled Silicon Valley thing is actually what has been the problem here, because I mean, literally in Tokyo, there's factories that make, world-class CCD camera, sensors and the most precision medical equipment in the world, Sony, all of these companies building precision hardware and exporting and building actual things. But they've lost out to the fiat thinking of software and UX and all of this, cheap money that's been kind of filtered into other things. And so I wonder if, Japan's just trucking along and making cars, phones, boats, all of this sort of stuff. And they just kind of missed the wagon with software and fiat thinking that came with, that whole wave.
Well, and tying it back to the fiat thing as well, like why are they slaving away to make all these exceptional camcorders or cars, these real things? It's to sell to the US market, right? And why do they need to sell to the US market? They need to sell to the US market to get dollars, because otherwise they can't get energy. You can't buy oil, right? So I see definitely that's a very good point, Cody.
Yeah, the Japanese might be a victim here in the sense of
I think so.
And I mean, tying it back to the geopolitics, I mean, even looking at the war, what happened there, I mean, there's different accounts, but obviously energy was one of the drivers for that, and access to oil, which is a talk for another day perhaps, but I mean, it's not a new phenomena. Cool. Well, look, guys, we've covered a few different things here. It's really interesting to dive back into it, and I appreciate your time. I am curious in terms of what Citadel builders are doing, what the Tokyo scene is doing. Where do you want to point people to? How can people find out about your meetups, about your podcast, and about your work?
Yeah, there's it's still minimal. It's we're slowly building, putting things together. There's the site tokyocitadel.com. There's the Citadel Builders podcast, which Mike Dash and myself do. There we have meetups that we try and put on every once in a while. For those who speak Japanese, there's Japanese outlets that we can point you to, particularly the Diamond Hands group. But for the most part, we are going through the breakdown phase so that we can rebuild phase. Slowly trying to put things back together, bringing people together, bring Bitcoin folk back together to see what we can start to build in the wake of the 2017 Roger Ver collapse.
Very, very well said. I just little shout out. I'm on Noster. I'm a big Noster fan now. Got into it since the new year, and so anyone wants to find me, I'm on there at dash DASH, and I'm nip5 on nosterplebs.com. So yeah, if you find me on Noster, I've got a pair of privacy glasses as my icon, and be happy to chat with anyone on there.
Yes, and
the last thing I'd say is anyone who comes to Tokyo, feel free to join our Telegram group. Let us know you're coming, and we try to do regular meetups, and it's always great to have visitors come and visiting Bitcoiners come and show up and meet us. So there will always be a bunch of us around here in Tokyo. So yeah, you can find our Telegram link should be on tokyocitadel.com.
Yeah, and I'll throw all of that into the show notes as well. But that's really cool. And is there a particular area of Tokyo that you'd say is Bitcoin Central, where you would meet up? Is there a part of town that is where it's happening?
We try to scatter our meetups in different parts of Tokyo. We've done the west side. We do Roppongi probably more often than not. And I know the other Bitcoin groups like mempool.space, their office is in Roppongi, so that's where their meetups are. The Diamond Hands meetups are usually also in Roppongi. There's a bar there that accepts Bitcoin, so that's a common place for Bitcoiners to go. But actually, we have one today, so it's Sakura season, so we're meeting up at the park today to hang out there.
That sounds very idyllic. Well, look, I won't hold you up from that meetup, but I do appreciate you guys' time. I think we covered some really good stuff, and I appreciate your insight. And it feels like we got through some great ideas. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or maybe we'll wrap it up there?
No, it's great. Look forward to your visit in May. Let us know when you're coming. We'll roll out the red carpet or whatever we can too.
The orange carpet.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sweet. All right. Andy Dash Mike, I much appreciate it, and we'll catch up in May in Tokyo.
Excellent. Later, brother.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank you.